Legends and movies tell us great stories about the samurai. About the unbeatable warriors with incredible skill and sharp blades. Imagine them on the battlefields. Shining swords whirling around gracefully and cutting through steel. Each move of these warriors is a deadly dance. Their fighting skill unmatched. Their loyalty absolute. Their presence terrifying. They are painted as war gods, masters of death blades. But behind this shining image, a dark truth hides, a reality far from the pretty stories. Was the samurai path truly glorious, or brutal hardship? What price was paid for a life with the sword? What trials awaited those born samurai? Beneath the polished armor and the sharp steel, a hidden story waits. A story of endless training and iron will. A life always near death. But what if the stories are lies? What if the warrior's path begins not with honor, but despair? The weight of expectation, a crushing burden for one so small, began not at the clang of steel or the roar of battle, but at the very moment of birth. For a child born into a samurai family in feudal Japan, the path was predetermined, a rigid and unforgiving trajectory etched in blood and tradition. It was not a question of if he would become a warrior, but when the rigorous training would commence, when the innocence of childhood would be sacrificed upon the altar of Bushido, the samurai code. This preordained destiny, this lack of choice, was the first bitter pill a samurai child had to swallow. From infancy, the child was not simply a baby, he was a future warrior, a vessel to be molded. The concept of carefree play, so integral to childhood development, was a foreign concept. Instead, even the earliest interactions were imbued with the principles of discipline and obedience. The swaddling clothes, though soft, were bound tightly, a symbolic representation of the constraints that would define his life. The lullabies sung by his mother were not gentle melodies of comfort, but tales of valorous ancestors and their glorious, often violent, deeds. The semantic field of war and honor permeated even the nursery. The family structure, often idealized in romanticized portrayals of samurai life, was frequently a source of emotional deprivation. While familial bonds existed, they were secondary to the demands of the warrior class. The father, a samurai himself, was often absent, engaged in military duties or serving his lord. The mother, while present, was tasked with instilling unwavering obedience and preparing the child for his future role. Affection, while present, was often expressed through strict discipline and unwavering adherence to social norms. This emotional distance, this suppression of individual expression, created a chilling atmosphere of emotional detachment. The social hierarchy of feudal Japan further compounded the challenges. The samurai occupied a privileged position, yet this privilege came at a steep cost. They were bound by a strict code of conduct, constantly under scrutiny from their superiors and peers. Even a child was not exempt from this societal pressure. He was constantly reminded of his lineage, his duty, and the shame that would befall his family should he fail to live up to expectations. This constant pressure, this unrelenting surveillance, created a pervasive sense of anxiety. The political landscape of the time added another layer of complexity. The shogunate, the military government, held absolute power, and the samurai served as its enforcers. This system was built on unwavering loyalty and unquestioning obedience. Even a child was taught to prioritize the interests of his lord above all else, including his own family. This political reality, this suppression of individual will, created a sense of powerlessness, even at such a tender age. The challenges were not merely abstract, they manifested in concrete realities. At the age of 3 or 4, the child would begin rudimentary physical training. These were not playful games, they were rigorous exercises designed to build strength, endurance, and discipline. He would practice basic swordsmanship with a wooden sword, the bokken, his small hands struggling to wield the unwieldy weapon. He would be subjected to harsh weather conditions, taught to endure cold, heat, and discomfort without complaint. This early exposure to physical hardship, this relentless pursuit of physical perfection, took a toll on the developing child. The intellectual development of the young samurai was also strictly regimented. He was taught to read and write, primarily focusing on classical Chinese texts and military treatises. The emphasis was not on creativity or critical thinking, but on rote memorization and adherence to established doctrines. This intellectual constraint, this suppression of intellectual curiosity, stifled the child's natural desire to explore the world around him. By the age of 6, the distinction between childhood and warrior training blurred irrevocably. The child was no longer simply a boy, he was a Kotaro, a young samurai in training. He would be assigned to a mentor, an experienced warrior who would guide his development. This mentorship, while intended to be beneficial, often involved harsh discipline and rigorous training. The child would be separated from his mother for extended periods, further exacerbating the emotional detachment that had characterized his early life. A typical occurrence at this age, marking the definitive transition, would be the Genpuku ceremony, a coming-of-age ritual. This ceremony, often held between the ages of 13 and 16 but sometimes earlier in exceptional cases, signified the boy's formal entry into the samurai ranks. However, the groundwork for this ceremony, the preparation for this momentous occasion, began much earlier. At 6 years old, a young boy might be presented with his first real katana, though blunted and for practice only. The weight of the steel, the coldness of the blade, was a tangible reminder of the path that lay ahead. This symbolic gesture, this premature exposure to the tools of war, marked the definitive end of childhood and the beginning of a life defined by duty, discipline, and the ever-present shadow of the sword. The semantic field of the sword, of war, of duty, of honor, now becomes a tangible, physical part of his life. The metaphorical sword now becomes physical. The transition from Kotaro, the young trainee, to a nascent warrior in his teenage years was not a gentle metamorphosis, but a brutal forging. The weight of the samurai's two swords, the katana and the wakizashi, now felt less like a symbolic burden and more like a physical manifestation of the immense pressure bearing down on him. This period, roughly spanning from ages 13 to 19, was a crucible, testing the mettle of these young men, pushing them to the very limits of their physical and mental endurance. It was a time of harsh realities, of confronting the true cost of Bushido, and of grappling with the inherent contradictions of a life dedicated to both martial prowess and unwavering loyalty. The physical training intensified exponentially. No longer were they practicing with wooden bokken, now they wielded sharpened steel. Sparring sessions became brutal tests of skill and resolve, with every cut and thrust carrying the potential for serious injury. The semantic field of combat became visceral, immediate. The abstract concepts of honor and duty were now intertwined with the very real sensation of steel against steel, the sting of a blow, the ever-present threat of death. This rigorous physical regimen, this constant exposure to violence, hardened them, yes, but it also eroded their youthful exuberance, replacing it with a grim pragmatism. Beyond the physical demands, the teenage samurai faced a complex web of social and political pressures. The rigid social hierarchy of feudal Japan dictated every aspect of their lives. They were bound by strict codes of conduct, meticulously detailed rules governing their behavior in every conceivable situation. A single misstep, a perceived breach of etiquette, could bring shame upon their family and jeopardize their lord's reputation. This constant self-monitoring, this fear of transgression, created a pervasive sense of unease. The political machinations of the shogunate further complicated matters. Intrigues, betrayals, and power struggles were commonplace, and the samurai were often caught in the crossfire. They were expected to be unwavering in their loyalty, even when faced with conflicting orders or morally ambiguous situations. This political reality, this constant shifting of alliances and power dynamics, instilled a deep sense of cynicism. They witnessed firsthand how easily honor could be compromised, how readily lives could be sacrificed in the pursuit of political gain. The family situation, often a source of solace in other societies, offered little respite for the teenage samurai. The emotional distance established in childhood often persisted, exacerbated by the increasing demands of their training. They were expected to prioritize their duty to their lord above all else, even family ties. This emotional detachment, this suppression of personal feelings, led to a sense of isolation, a feeling of being adrift in a world that demanded unwavering obedience but offered little in the way of emotional support. The antithesis of duty and personal feeling was a constant struggle. Furthermore, the samurai's family often relied on him for their social standing and financial security. This created an additional layer of pressure, a fear of failure that extended beyond personal shame to encompass the well-being of his entire family. This burden, this weight of familial expectation, could be crushing. As they approached manhood, the samurai faced the daunting prospect of finding a suitable match. Marriages were not based on love or personal affection, but on political alliances and social standing. These unions were often arranged by their families or their lord, with little regard for the individual's desires. This lack of agency, this denial of personal choice in such a fundamental aspect of life, further contributed to their sense of disillusionment. The semantic field of love and affection was often replaced by obligation and political strategy. The concept of romantic love, as understood in modern times, was largely absent from the samurai's world. Instead, marriage was viewed as a strategic alliance, a means of consolidating power and ensuring the continuation of the family line. This pragmatic approach to marriage, this suppression of emotional needs, created a sense of emptiness, a void that could never be filled by duty or honor. A typical event marking this transition into manhood, and the culmination of their teenage training, was their first experience in actual combat. This could take many forms: participation in a local skirmish, serving as a guard during a diplomatic mission, or even being sent to quell a peasant uprising. For many, this first taste of battle was a profoundly traumatic experience. The idealized notions of valor and glory quickly dissolved in the face of the brutal reality of war. The experience of the fighting, the sheer chaos of combat, shattered their youthful illusions. For one such young samurai, this experience came during a minor border dispute. He had trained for years, mastering the art of swordsmanship, memorizing military tactics, and internalizing the principles of Bushido. But nothing could have prepared him for the horrors he experienced on the battlefield. The smells, the sounds and the images on the battlefield, these were sensory experiences that would forever be etched into his memory. The experience was transformative. The boy who had left for battle was gone, replaced by a hardened, disillusioned young man, forever marked by the horrors he had witnessed. This event, this brutal initiation into the realities of war, marked the definitive end of his teenage years and the beginning of his life as a full-fledged samurai, a life defined by violence, duty, and the ever-present weight of expectation. The passage from youthful warrior to seasoned samurai, spanning roughly from 30 to 50 years of age, was not a graceful descent into comfortable seniority. It was, rather, a protracted and often agonizing confrontation with the limitations of the body, the erosion of youthful ideals, and the ever-present weight of responsibility. This period, this middle age of a samurai's life, was a time of reckoning, a time when the promises of glory and honor often gave way to the harsh realities of service, the complexities of political maneuvering, and the quiet desperation of a life lived under constant constraint. The physical prowess that had defined their youth began to wane. The swiftness of their sword arm, the stamina that had allowed them to endure grueling campaigns, began to diminish. The semantic field of physical decline became increasingly prominent in their lives. Old wounds, once easily dismissed, now ached with a persistent throb. The constant training, the countless battles, had taken their toll. The body, once a finely tuned instrument of war, now felt like a worn and weary tool. This physical decline was not merely a personal matter, it had profound implications for their social and political standing. In a society that valued martial prowess above all else, any sign of weakness was seen as a liability. Younger, more vigorous samurai were constantly vying for positions of power and influence, creating a competitive and often ruthless environment. The aging samurai found themselves increasingly marginalized, their voices less heeded, their opinions less valued. This social and political marginalization, this gradual erosion of their status, created a deep sense of insecurity. The political landscape of feudal Japan, always complex and treacherous, became even more challenging for the aging samurai. Intrigues, betrayals, and power struggles intensified as ambitious lords sought to expand their influence. The samurai, bound by their code of loyalty, were often forced to navigate these treacherous waters, balancing their duty to their lord with their own survival. This political maneuvering, this constant need to assess and reassess allegiances, created a profound sense of moral ambiguity. The antithesis of loyalty and self-preservation was a constant internal conflict. The family situation, often a source of both comfort and conflict throughout a samurai's life, took on a new dimension during this period. Many samurai had now reached the age where they had sons of their own, young men who were beginning their own journey along the path of the warrior. This created a new set of challenges, as the aging samurai had to balance their paternal duties with their obligations to their lord. They were responsible for training their sons, instilling in them the principles of Bushido, while simultaneously fulfilling their own military and political responsibilities. This dual role, this conflict between familial duty and feudal obligation, created a significant strain. Furthermore, the aging samurai often had to confront the consequences of their past actions. The violence they had inflicted, the lives they had taken, now weighed heavily on their consciences. The semantic field of guilt and regret became increasingly prominent. The youthful ideals of honor and glory now seemed hollow in the face of the brutal realities of war. This moral reckoning, this confrontation with their past, created a deep sense of disillusionment. The weight of expectation, once focused on their physical prowess, now shifted to their wisdom and experience. They were expected to serve as advisors, mentors, and strategists, drawing upon their years of service to guide younger generations. However, this transition from active warrior to elder statesman was not always smooth. Many samurai struggled to adapt to this new role, clinging to the fading glory of their youth. This struggle for relevance, this difficulty in accepting the changing nature of their role, created a sense of frustration. A typical occurrence for a samurai reaching the age of 50 was retirement from active military service. This was not always a welcome event. For many, the life of a warrior was the only life they had ever known. The idea of relinquishing their swords, of stepping away from the battlefield, was a daunting prospect. This transition to a life of relative inactivity, this loss of their primary identity, created a sense of emptiness. However, retirement did not necessarily mean a life of leisure. Many samurai continued to serve their lord in other capacities, as administrators, advisors, or instructors. Others dedicated themselves to the study of philosophy, literature, or the arts. This transition, this adaptation to a new phase of life, was not always easy, but it was a necessary part of the samurai's journey. For one such samurai, named Kenso, this transition came after decades of loyal service. He had fought in countless battles, witnessed the rise and fall of powerful lords, and experienced the full spectrum of human emotion, from the exhilaration of victory to the despair of defeat. Now, at the age of 50, he was granted permission to retire to a small estate in the countryside. The day he laid down his swords, the weight of them felt not just physical, but metaphorical. The weight of duty, the weight of expectation, the weight of a life lived according to a strict and unforgiving code. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred, and saw not the instruments of war, but the tools of a life lived in service. He spent his remaining years tending to his garden, studying calligraphy, and reflecting on the meaning of his life. He found a measure of peace in these simple pursuits, a peace that had eluded him during his years as a warrior. But even in retirement, the shadow of the samurai's life lingered. The memories of battle, the faces of fallen comrades, the weight of responsibility, these were burdens that he would carry with him to his grave.